Ethan King hurried through the rain-slicked streets of New York, his coat pulled tight against the chill. As a social worker, late nights were part of the job. But tonight felt different. A strange energy crackled in the air, setting his nerves on edge. A muffled cry from a darkened alley made him pause. He peered into the shadows, his heart pounding as he made out two small figures huddled behind a dumpster. Their skin was pale and dotted with iridescent spots, marking them unmistakably as Trill, one of the many alien refugee species seeking asylum on Earth. "Hey there," Ethan called softly, approaching slowly so as not to startle him. "Are you okay?" Two pairs of glowing eyes looked up at him, wide with fear. The older girl, who couldn't have been more than 8 in human years, pulled the younger one close. "Please don't hurt us," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan knelt down to their level, his heart breaking at the sight of their tear-stained faces. "I'm not going to hurt you," he promised. "My name's Ethan. I'm here to help. Can you tell me your names?" The older girl hesitated, searching his face for any sign of deception. Finally, she said, "I'm Mira. This is my sister, Zara. We're lost. We got separated from our parents during the evacuation." Ethan's stomach clenched. The ongoing conflict on the Trill home world had prompted a mass exodus, with desperate families fleeing to any planet that would take them. Earth, already struggling with its own problems, had grudgingly agreed to accept a limited number of Trill refugees. But the influx had strained resources to the breaking point, leaving many newcomers homeless and vulnerable. He couldn't bear the thought of these children fending for themselves on the dangerous city streets. "Mira, Zara, would you like to come with me?" he asked gently. "I have a warm, safe place where you can stay until we find your parents." Mira exchanged a long look with her sister, a silent conversation passing between them. At last she nodded. "Okay," she said softly, taking Zara's hand as they stood out. As Ethan led the girls out of the alley, he noticed a strange glow emanating from their skin. It was subtle, easily mistaken for a trick of the light. But something told him there was more to these children than met the eye. Over the next few days, as he cared for Mira and Zara in his small apartment, Ethan's suspicions only grew. Objects moved on their own when the girls were nearby. Electronics flickered and sparked with no discernible cause. And at night, as the sisters slept, their skin shimmered with an ethereal energy that defied explanation. Ethan knew he should report their presence to the authorities, but something held him back. These girls had been through enough trauma already. The last thing they needed was to be caught up in the bureaucratic nightmare of the overloaded refugee system. And if he was being honest with himself, he'd grown attached to them. Their resilience, their bond with each other, touched something deep inside him. He made discreet inquiries through his social services contacts, hoping to locate Mira and Zara's parents quietly. But as the days stretched into weeks with no leads, he began to worry that reuniting this family might be more complicated than he'd anticipated. His fears were confirmed when a bulletin from the Extraterrestrial Affairs Bureau crossed his desk at work. The Trill government had reached out to Earth authorities with an urgent message. The two missing daughters of the Trill Emperor were believed to be hiding somewhere on Earth. They were to be located and returned immediately. The bulletin included images of the girls, and Ethan's heart nearly stopped when he saw Mira and Zara's faces looking back at him. The strange markings on their arms, which he'd assumed were just part of their alien physiology, took on new meaning. These were no ordinary refugee children he'd taken in. They were royalty, with powerful abilities beyond human understanding. And now the most dangerous forces on two worlds would be coming for them. Ethan took a deep breath, his mind reeling as he tried to process the implications. He knew he should turn the girls over, wash his hands of this whole situation before it was too late. But as he watched Mira and Zara playing together that evening, their laughter echoing through his apartment, he knew he couldn't abandon them to an uncertain fate. He had to find a way to keep them safe, no matter the cost. Little did he know that the cost would be higher than he ever could have imagined, because in the shadows, unseen forces were already mobilizing, determined to capture the young princesses and harness their power for their own ends. And Ethan was about to find himself at the center of a conflict that would change the course of human and alien relations forever. Secrets revealed. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan found himself growing increasingly attached to Mira and Zara. Despite the challenges of caring for two alien children with powers he barely understood, he couldn't imagine his life without them now. But keeping their true identities hidden was proving more difficult by the day. The girls' abilities were getting stronger, harder to control. Mira could levitate objects with a thought, while Zara's touch could short out electronic devices. Ethan found himself constantly making excuses to curious neighbors and coworkers, trying to explain away the strange occurrences that followed the sisters wherever they went. Things came to a head when Ethan enrolled the girls in school. He knew they needed structure and socialization, but he worried about how they would handle the increased scrutiny. His fears proved well-founded when, during a routine medical exam, the school nurse noticed the strange markings on Mira and Zara's arms. "Mr. King, may I speak with you privately?" the nurse asked, her voice tight with concern. Ethan's heart sank as he followed her into her office. He braced himself for the inevitable questions, the accusations of negligence or worse. But when the nurse spoke, it was with a tone of awe rather than reproach. "These markings," she said, tracing a finger over the glowing patterns on a scan of Mira's arm. "I'd seen them before. In my studies of Trill culture, they're the sacred symbols of the royal family, passed down through generations." Ethan's mouth went dry. He'd suspected the girls were more than they appeared, but hearing it confirmed out loud was still a shock. The nurse fixed him with a penetrating look. "Mr. King, do you have any idea what this means? These children are not just refugees. They're princesses, the daughters of the Trill Emperor himself. And if the stories are true, they possess powers beyond anything we can imagine." Ethan's mind raced as he tried to process the implications. He'd been harboring alien royalty, putting himself and everyone around him at risk. If the wrong people found out, he thanked the nurse for her discretion and hurried home, his thoughts in turmoil. He needed to come up with a plan, find a way to keep Mira and Zara safe until he could figure out what to do next. But when he arrived at his apartment, he found the girls in a state of panic. Zara was curled up on the couch, her face pale and spotted with sweat. Mira hovered over her, tears streaming down her face. "Ethan, something's wrong with Zara," Mira cried, her voice breaking. "She's sick, really sick. I don't know what to do." Ethan rushed to Zara's side, feeling her forehead. She was burning up, her skin clammy to the touch. He tried to remember what he knew about Trill physiology, but his mind was blank. He needed help, but he couldn't risk taking Zara to a human hospital if anyone discovered her true identity. Desperate, he reached out to the only person he could think of, Dr. Lyra Voss, a brilliant xenobiologist who ran a secret clinic for alien refugees. He'd met her months ago, when he first started looking for information on the Trill. She was an outsider like him, driven by a fierce desire to help those in need. Dr. Voss arrived within the hour, her medkit slung over her shoulder. She examined Zara with a grave expression, her fingers flying over the high-tech instruments she'd brought with her. "It's a rare virus," she said at last, her voice tight. "It affects Trill children sometimes, when they're adapting to a new environment. Her body is trying to fight it off, but the strain is too much for her system to handle." She looked up at Ethan, her eyes filled with a mix of sympathy and steel. "She needs specialized care, more than I can provide here. And we need to act fast. If we don't get her stabilized soon." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Ethan's heart clenched at the unspoken implication. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice raw with fear. Dr. Voss hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "There's a place," she said at last. "A hidden facility, run by my people. It's not far from here, but it's well guarded. They have the technology and expertise to help Zara. But Ethan, if we take her there, there's no going back. You'll be crossing a line, aligning yourself with forces that most of your world doesn't even know exist. Are you prepared for that?" Ethan looked at Zara's small, fragile form, at Mira's tear-stained face. In that moment, he knew there was no choice at all. "Let's go," he said simply. And with those two words, he sealed his fate, and the fate of everyone he loved. Because unbeknownst to him, other forces were already on the move, closing in on the precious cargo he now carried. The Trill Emperor's agents, ruthless and determined. The Earth authorities, desperate to contain the situation before it spiraled out of control. And a third faction, hidden in the shadows, with an agenda all their own. An agenda that would put Ethan and the girls at the center of a conflict that could reshape the galaxy itself. As they raced through the night, Zara cradled in Ethan's arms and Mira clinging to his hand, he could only pray that he'd made the right choice. Because one thing was certain, there was no turning back now. The die had been cast, and the game was about to begin. Dangers converge. The hidden facility was a marvel of alien technology, all sleek lines and shimmering force fields. Dr. Voss led Ethan and the girls through a maze of corridors, past rooms filled with equipment he couldn't even begin to understand. "Ethan!" A familiar voice jolted him out of his daze. He turned to see Jack Ryder, his old friend from his days as a beat cop, striding towards him with a grim expression. "What are you doing here?" Ethan asked, his eyes widening in surprise. Jack glanced around, as if to make sure they weren't being overheard. "I could ask you the same thing," he muttered. "Do you have any idea what you've gotten yourself into?" Ethan bristled at the accusation in Jack's tone. "I'm trying to save a little girl's life," he snapped. "What's your excuse?" Jack's face softened, just a fraction. "I'm trying to help you, you idiot," he said, his voice low and urgent. "You need to get those kids out of here now, before it's too late." Ethan frowned, a cold feeling settling in the pit of his stomach. "What are you talking about?" Jack ran a hand over his face, the scars from his years on the force standing out in stark relief. "I've been working with the Earth Alliance," he said quietly, "trying to keep a lid on this whole alien thing, and word just came down from on high. They know about the princesses. They're sending in a team to extract them tonight." Ethan's heart lurched in his chest. "Extract them? You mean kidnap them?" Jack shook his head. "It's not like that," he insisted. "They just want to keep them safe until they can figure out what to do next. But Ethan, if the Trill find out, if they think we're holding their royals hostage, it could spark an interstellar war." Ethan's mind raced, trying to process the implications. He'd known on some level that he was getting in over his head. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. He looked over at Mira and Zara, huddled together on a bench outside the treatment room where Dr. Voss had disappeared with Zara. They looked so small, so vulnerable. The thought of anyone trying to take them away, to use them as pawns in some galactic chess game. "I can't let that happen," he said, his voice heartening with resolve. "I won't let anyone hurt them, Jack. Not the Trill, not the Earth Alliance, not anyone." Jack's eyes widened, as if seeing Ethan for the first time. "You really care about them, don't you?" he said softly. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "They're my family now," he said simply, "and I'll do whatever it takes to keep them safe." Jack was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. Then he straightened, as if coming to a decision. "Okay," he said, his voice filled with a new determination. "Then we'd better get moving, because if we're going to get you out of here, we need to do it fast." They gathered Mira and Zara, moving quickly and quietly through the facility. Dr. Voss joined them, her expression grim as she explained Zara's condition. "She's stable for now," she said, her voice tight, "but she needs ongoing treatment, more than I can provide on the run. We need to get her somewhere safe, somewhere with the resources to help her." Ethan's mind raced, trying to think of a place that fit that description. Then it hit him. "The refugee camp," he said, his voice rising with excitement. "The one on the outskirts of the city. They have a medical center there, staffed by Trill doctors. If we can get the girls there." Jack nodded, already pulling out his communicator. "I'll arrange for transport," he said briskly. "But we need to move now." They were halfway to the exit when the alarm started blaring. Ethan's heart leaped into his throat as he saw the flashing lights, heard the pounding of feet on the hard floors. He scooped Zara up in his arms, adrenaline giving him strength he didn't know he had. "This way," Jack shouted, veering off down a side corridor. They ran, the sounds of pursuit growing closer with every passing second. Mira's hand was slick with sweat in Ethan's, her breath coming in ragged gasps. And then suddenly they were outside, the cool night air hitting Ethan's face like a slap. A sleek black transport was waiting for them, its engines humming with barely contained power. But as they raced towards it, a new sound split the air. The high-pitched whine of Trill weaponry, the sizzle of energy beams cutting through the darkness. Ethan yanked Mira to the ground, shielding her with his body as the beams sizzled overhead. He heard Jack curse, the sound of return fire as he tried to cover their escape. And then, through the chaos, a new voice. Cold, imperious, filled with a kind of leashed menace that made Ethan's blood run cold. "Surrender the princesses," it said, each word ringing with authority, "or face the consequences." Ethan looked up, his eyes widening as he saw the figure emerge from the shadows. Tall, cloaked in black, with eyes that glowed an eerie red in the darkness. A Trill shadow guard, the Emperor's personal enforcers, ruthless, relentless, and utterly devoted to their cause. Ethan's mind raced, desperately searching for a way out. But there was none. They were surrounded, outgunned, with nowhere left to run. He looked down at Mira and Zara, saw the fear in their eyes, the trust. And he knew with a sudden, blinding clarity that there was only one thing left to do. He straightened slowly, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Take me," he said, his voice ringing out across the battlefield. "Let the girls go, and take me instead." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then the Shadow Guard laughed, a harsh, grating sound that made Ethan's skin crawl. "You are in no position to negotiate, human," it said, its voice dripping with contempt. But before it could say anything else, a new sound split the air. A sound Ethan had never heard before, but one he recognized instantly. A daring plan. The ship descended from the sky like a gleaming silver arrow, its sleek lines and powerful engines unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. It landed with a hiss of hydraulics, the ramp lowering to reveal a figure standing tall and proud in the doorway. "Mother," Mira cried, her voice breaking with relief and joy. Ethan stared in disbelief as the Trill Empress herself strode down the ramp, her bearing regal and her eyes blazing with determination. She was flanked by a squad of heavily armed guards, their weapons trained on the Shadow Guard with unwavering precision. "Release my daughters," the Empress commanded, her voice ringing with authority, "and the human who has protected them. Now." For a moment the Shadow Guard seemed to hesitate, caught between its loyalty to the Emperor and the unassailable power of the Empress. Then slowly it lowered its weapon, signaling its squad to do the same. Ethan felt a rush of relief so intense it left him lightheaded. He stumbled forward, Zara still cradled in his arms, Mira clinging to his hand. The Empress met them halfway, her eyes softening as she looked at her daughters. "My precious girls," she murmured, pulling them into a fierce embrace. "I thought I had lost you." Mira and Zara clung to their mother, their small bodies shaking with sobs. Ethan watched, his heart aching with a bittersweet mix of joy and loss. He knew this was the moment he had been dreading, the moment he would have to say goodbye. But the Empress surprised him. She looked up, her gaze meeting his with a kind of profound gratitude that took his breath away. "Ethan King," she said softly, "I owe you a debt I can never repay. You have risked everything to keep my daughters safe, and for that you have earned my eternal friendship." Ethan swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. I was just doing what anyone would do," he managed at last. The Empress shook her head, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "No," she said simply. "Not anyone. You are a rare and precious thing, Ethan King, a true hero." She straightened, her gaze hardening as she turned to face the Shadow Guard. "As for you," she said, her voice cold as ice, "you have overstepped your authority, and in doing so, you have brought shame upon the Emperor and upon our people. You will return to Trill immediately to face the consequences of your actions." The Shadow Guard stiffened, as if it wanted to argue. But one look at the Empress's face seemed to change its mind. It bowed, a quick, jerky motion, and then turned on its heel and marched away, its squad falling in behind it. Ethan let out a shaky breath, hardly daring to believe it was over. But even as relief washed over him, a new fear started to take hold. "Zara," he said urgently, looking down at the small, pale form in his arms. "She's sick. She needs medical attention, more than we can give her here." The Empress's eyes widened, her hand flying to her daughter's forehead. "We must get her to Trill immediately," she said, her voice tight with worry. "Our doctors will be able to help her." Ethan hesitated, torn between his desperate need to keep Zara safe and the knowledge of what leaving Earth would mean. He looked at Mira, saw the pleading in her eyes, and felt his resolve crumble. "I'm coming with you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. I can't leave them. Not now." The Empress nodded, as if she had expected nothing less. "Of course," she said gently. "You are family now, Ethan King, and family stays together." They boarded the ship, Ethan cradling Zara close as Mira clung to her mother's hand. He looked back one last time, taking in the familiar skyline of the city he had called home for so long. He thought of Jack and Dr. Voss, of all the people who had helped him along the way, and felt a pang of regret. But as the ship lifted off, the stars blurring into streaks of light outside the viewport, he knew he had made the right choice. He was where he needed to be, with the people he loved most in the world. And whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever dangers they might face, they would face them together, as a family. Sacrifice and new beginnings. The journey to Trill passed in a blur of medical tests and hushed conversations, the Empress's personal physicians working around the clock to stabilize Zara's condition. Ethan hardly left her side, holding her hand and murmuring words of comfort as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Mira, too, refused to leave her sister, her small face set in a mask of determination, as she helped the doctors in any way she could. Ethan marveled at her strength, at the fierce love and loyalty that bound the two girls together. When they finally arrived on Trill, Ethan found himself awestruck by the sheer beauty of the planet. Soaring spires of crystal and glass rose from lush green forests, the air shimmering with a kind of iridescent energy that made his skin tingle. But there was no time to take in the sights. Zara was whisked away to the Royal Medical Facility, a team of the finest doctors and scientists on the planet working tirelessly to find a cure for her condition. Ethan and Mira were given quarters in the Royal Palace, a suite of rooms so opulent it made Ethan's head spin. But even surrounded by luxury, he couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in the pit of his stomach. He knew on some level that he didn't belong here, that he was an outsider, a human in a world of aliens, with no real place in the grand scheme of things. And yet, when he looked at Mira and Zara, when he saw the love and trust in their eyes, he knew he would do anything to keep them safe, even if it meant sacrificing everything he had ever known. The days passed in a haze of worry and fear, Ethan and Mira spending every waking moment at Zara's bedside. And then, finally, a breakthrough. A new treatment derived from the unique energy signatures of the royal family that seemed to hold the key to Zara's recovery. Ethan watched, his heart in his throat, as the doctors administered the treatment. For a long, terrifying moment, nothing happened. And then slowly, miraculously, Zara's eyes fluttered open, her spots glowing with a healthy, vibrant light. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with wonder. Are we home?" Ethan felt tears spring to his eyes, a relieved laugh bubbling up from somewhere deep inside him. "Yes, little one," he said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "We're home." The Empress wept with joy, gathering her daughters into her arms and holding them close. Ethan watched, his heart full to bursting, as the royal family was reunited at last. But even as they celebrated Zara's recovery, Ethan knew that their troubles were far from over. The Emperor, who had been away on a diplomatic mission, was due to return any day now. And when he learned of what had happened, of the role Ethan had played in protecting his daughters, Ethan didn't know what to expect. But he knew he would face whatever king with his head held high, secure in the knowledge that he had done what was right. The day of the Emperor's return dawned bright and clear, the palace buzzing with activity as the royal court prepared for his arrival. Ethan stood tall and proud beside the Empress and her daughters, his heart pounding as the Emperor's ship touched down on the landing pad. The Emperor emerged, his bearing regal and his eyes sharp as he took in the scene before him. His gaze landed on Ethan, and for a moment, Ethan saw a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. But then the Empress stepped forward, her voice ringing out clear and strong as she told the story of all that had happened. Of the bravery and selflessness of the human who had protected her daughters, who had risked everything to keep them safe. The Emperor listened, his expression inscrutable, and then, to Ethan's amazement, he smiled. "Ethan King," he said, his voice warm with gratitude, "you have done a great service to the royal family, and to all of Trill. You have shown courage and compassion beyond measure, and for that, you have earned our eternal friendship." He stepped forward, clasping Ethan's hand in a firm grip. "From this day forward," he proclaimed, "you are a member of the royal court with all the rights and privileges that entails. You will always have a home here on Trill, and a place in our hearts." Ethan felt tears prick at his eyes, a lump rising in his throat as he tried to find the words to express his gratitude. But before he could speak, Mira and Zara rushed forward, throwing their arms around him in a fierce hug. "We love you, Ethan," Mira whispered, her face buried in his chest. "Thank you for being our family." Ethan held them close, his heart full to bursting with love and pride. And as he looked out over the shining city of Trill, he knew that he had found his true home at last. The years that followed were filled with joy and wonder, as Ethan took on the role of ambassador between Earth and Trill. He worked tirelessly to build bridges of understanding between the two worlds, using his unique perspective and experiences to foster a new era of cooperation and friendship. Mira and Zara grew into strong, beautiful young women, their powers blossoming under the guidance of the royal tutors. They never forgot the kindness and bravery of the human who had saved them, and they made it their mission to carry on his legacy of compassion and unity. And Ethan, for his part, never forgot the incredible journey that had brought him to this place. He knew that he had been given a rare and precious gift, the chance to make a real difference in the world. And he vowed to spend the rest of his life living up to that responsibility, to being the best father, friend, and ambassador he could be. For he knew now that family was not defined by blood or species, but by the unbreakable bonds of love and loyalty that held them together. And as long as he had Mira and Zara by his side, he knew that he could face anything the universe could throw at him. Together, they would build a brighter future, one filled with hope and possibility. A future where anything was possible, and where the stars themselves were within reach.